Welcome back, guys, to part 2 of ray tracing on the RX 7900 XTX in 2025. If you missed part 1, which I'll link below, we looked at 4 games with transformative ray tracing, and today we're going to continue down the list of games that I've chosen. Now, to make this a bit more interesting, I'll also be showing my RTX 3080 Ti as a comparison. System specs will be in the description. We're going to pick up with Cyberpunk 2077, and this is a good game to take a look at just because we have so much ray tracing, we have path tracing, and I wanted to dig into this a bit more for you guys to show you what you can do with the 7900 XTX in here, because you can do quite a bit. But I wanted to start with 1440p, Psycho ray tracing, everything maximum. And we're just going to run across the street here, but we're getting around 35, 36 FPS with the 7900 XTX and the ray tracing maxed out. Path tracing is disabled, although we are going to look at that as well. But I just wanted to test this little strip here and just get an average FPS, which is around 34. Now, if we hop over to the 3080 Ti and run the same exact settings as we did on the XTX, run across that same strip, we end up doing actually a little bit better. At the end of the run, we averaged around 41 FPS. And we also had slightly higher 1% lows as well, which makes sense because we are using the same CPU, a Ryzen 9800X 3D, which is, one of the fastest CPUs that you can currently buy for gaming, obviously. But yeah, there seems to be a little bit of a difference, which is not really all that surprising in some of these games that have multiple ray tracing effects. But yeah, I would say about what you'd expect. But if we wanted to claw back some performance on the 7900 XTX, we can drop ray trace lighting from Psycho to Ultra, and you'd actually be surprised. We go from around 34 FPS or so to 43. That's a pretty good jump, and we're still at 1440p native, by the way. Now, throwing FSR here, I still think FSR looks pretty good, although it does have its issues in this game. But at 1440p FSR quality, I think you do eventually get used to it, and I think it works well enough. And as you can see with the 7900 XTX at 1440p, with almost maxed out ray tracing, we averaged around 68 FPS with 56 FPS for 1% lows. That's actually pretty good. And then if we hop on over to the 3080 Ti and reduce ray trace lighting to Ultra as well, with DLSS set to quality as well, we do actually do a little bit better than the 7900 XTX, where we had 68 average on the XTX. On the 3080 Ti, we have 74 FPS average. Now, 1% lows were pretty much identical, which I guess kind of makes sense because we are using the same CPU. And that gap has now shrunk a little bit once you add in FSR and DLSS, which is pretty interesting. But what about path tracing? I don't think path tracing is really worth it, but we'll check it out anyway. And then I'll show you some other ways you can enhance your experience as well, and some pretty big flaws. Alright, so now we're back on the 7900 XTX. We've enabled path tracing and set FSR to quality at 1440p. Well, the cost to performance, guys, it's massive. We went from 68 FPS average with FSR quality and ray tracing on Ultra all the way down to averaging 29 FPS with path tracing. And this is why I say it's not really worth it to run path tracing on Radeon GPUs, because just the cost is so big that it doesn't really justify, at least for me, in my opinion. But what about the 3080 Ti? How does that compare with these same settings? Now, for the sake of transparency, every time I've changed the settings in Cyberpunk, I've restarted the game because I know this game can sometimes be tricky and settings sometimes don't click until you restart the game. But the 3080 Ti at 1440p with DLSS set to quality and path tracing enabled does actually much better. We average 49 FPS versus the 29 on the XTX. So as you can see, architecturally, the NVIDIA GPU is more fit to handle path tracing in this case. Now, we could drop FSR to balance on the 7900 XTX, and yeah, it will go from around 29 FPS to the mid-30s, But FSR balance at 1440p, this game also doesn't have the best implementation of FSR. That's one of the flaws, although not the fault of the 7900 XTX in my opinion. But yeah, not worth it. Now if we go back to the 3080 Ti, and if we were to drop DLSS from quality to balance with path tracing at 1440p, well, we actually get a lot closer to 60 FPS. We do end up averaging around 53, 54 FPS, and DLSS balance here looks much better than the current FSR 3.1 allegedly. That's in this game. It does look a lot more stable. So I would say 3080 Ti, it's definitely very playable with path tracing at 1440p anyway. I think 4K would be too big of a cost to try to manage around 60 FPS. But the 7900 XTX has some other advantages that the 3080 Ti does not. So let's go over that. Now, before I show you that, because I know someone is going to ask, why didn't you try FSR 3 frame generation that's in this game? So, well, here we are with FSR balance again at 1440p, path tracing enabled, and FSR frame generation. The problem is that FSR frame generation implementation in this game, it's not good. And it's not the fault of the 7900 XTX. I've seen FSR frame generation. You can usually keep up with DLSS frame generation as far as image quality goes, and even generate more frames in a lot of cases, especially if you use a Radeon GPU. But here I was getting screen tearing for whatever reason, and mix that with FSR balance, it just didn't look very good. So yeah, I don't think there's really any good ways to combat the cost of path tracing in this game, but there is ways to enhance your experience even further with just the regular, maxing out the regular ray tracing, which actually looks really good in this game. Alright then, so what I did was I scrapped path tracing out of the equation and FSR 3 frame generation out of the equation because I don't think they work really good in this setup. But we are going with Psycho ray tracing now and FSR quality. What I wanted to try here actually was AFMF, and that's why I've changed the layout just a little bit. If you look, we're currently getting 64 FPS, and right there it says real FPS. And it's because the below metric, the white one where it says FPS, that's going to show us the total amount of frames. Right now, AFMF is disabled, so it says 64 FPS for both. But I also wanted to show you guys the cost to turning AFMF on, because there is a cost. So we're getting 64 FPS without turning AFMF on. And once we turn AFMF on, we went from 64 real frames to 61 real frames. And that's because there is a cost to generate extra frames. But total amount of frames, including the driver generated frames, is 121 FPS. That is the white bar directly below. So that is the frames that I'm seeing on the screen. And you know what, guys? It actually looks pretty good. I have to say, it looks better than the FSR 3 implementation that's in the game. I don't think I'd ever say that because AFMF usually has its own shortcomings that I haven't been a big fan of, but I have to say that even in motion, this actually looks very, very smooth. So I am impressed. The only problem that I have that kind of relates only to me is that I'm using a 120 hertz OLED TV display. So anytime it goes above 120, I get a bit of screen tearing. But that's not the fault of AFMF or anything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to lock the frame rate. And what I've done is I've locked the frame rate to 59 FPS because even at 60, doubling that to 120 can lead into some screen tearing for me. But I've locked it to 59 FPS, so we shouldn't go above 118. And I have to say, even in fast motion like this, it actually looks pretty good, guys. So I am impressed. AFMF seems to have come quite a bit of a long way. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have its faults. It does, but I think it works better than FSR 3 frame generation in this game. Crazy, I know. But yeah, I ended up capturing this footage at 120 frames per second, and I've slowed it down to 60. And if you look on the right where all the shrubs are, you do get some garbling and a bit of flickering from AFMF. So, I mean, AFMF is never going to be as good as a like FSR frame generation, except for in this game, because the implementation is quite bad from CD Projekt Red. Now, there's conspiracies about that. You can think what you will. We're just judging what we see here. And we did have some issues with the lighting in this tunnel here. So I'm not sure what that is all about. But again, you can see that AFMF tends to magnify the flicker, which, we also have FSR balance that's working against us a little bit. But yeah, guys, I had to spend a bit more time in Cyberpunk specifically because it's a very interesting game, right? It has a lot of different technologies that, we can test out and even check out some of the Radeon exclusive features like AFMF, for example, so that you guys can see. But yeah, the Achilles heel for FMF, at least from what I've seen, is if you look at the shrubs, for example, whenever there's a camera change, they tend to flicker a lot more and there's quite a bit of garbling. But other than that, I mean, it's come quite a bit of a long way since the first time it launched, which I thought didn't look very good at all. But yeah, that's Cyberpunk. Now let's move on to the next game on the list. Now, the next game that has ray trace global illumination on by default is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I would say one of the best games to have come out this year. I've really been enjoying playing this one, but we've set the game to 1440p again, like all the other games that we looked at previously, and we've maxed out all the settings on the 7900 XTX. Obviously, we don't have access to the full ray tracing options yet, and we don't have FSR in the game yet, so we're running it at 1440p native. And guess what? The 7900 XTX is an absolute beast. It does extremely well. So this is an example of a game that's recent and that has ray tracing on by default. I feel we're going to get more of these games, and Doom Dark Ages has been announced to have path tracing as well, so it's probably going to be another game similar to this one, uses the same engine, where I suspect that it's probably going to have ray tracing turned on by default. And I think that's actually good because the GPU hardware that we currently have is actually very capable. I mean, we could already run Metro Exodus, for example, that had ray tracing on by default, that looked really well, and it runs really well on both Radeon and GeForce GPUs. But yeah, the 7900 XTX in this game does extremely well. We're averaging around 140 FPS or so, with 120 FPS for 1% lows. And just keep in mind that our 1% lows are being negatively impacted by the autosave system that's in this game, which causes a little stutter. Has nothing to do with GPU brand or the type of CPU you use. It happens on all of them. Anywho, let's take a look at the 3080 Ti in this same exact similar scenario. Alright, so now we're on the 3080 Ti and we're running the game at 1440p. We've maxed out all the graphical settings, and as you can see, we do have access to path tracing on the 3080 Ti, and actually it can do path tracing in this game if you make a couple of tweaks, even though it is VRAM hungry, and even though the 3080 Ti can run into VRAM issues. I made a video where I dig really deep into it to show that it is possible to do path tracing on the 3080 Ti, but if we do match the same exact settings on the 7900 XTX, well, the 7900 XTX is way ahead, whereas we average 148 FPS on the 7900 XTX. On the 3080 Ti, we averaged 110 FPS. So yeah, the XTX well ahead. For 1% lows, we had 124 FPS on the 7900 XTX and 93 FPS on the 3080 Ti. Again, I mean, it's excellent performance on both GPUs, but you can see how the XTX, under certain circumstances and different types of ray tracing, it can pull way ahead of the 3080 Ti. And in some more, I guess, complex or NVIDIA sponsored games, the 3080 Ti can match or even be ahead a little bit. So again, it will depend on the game and how well it's optimized, the type of denoisers they're using, stuff that I may not know a whole lot about, but all these things can impact the performance. But yeah, Indiana Jones, very well optimized game, extremely scalable game. I mean, it runs at 60 FPS on a Series S, guys. Great job. All right, let's look at the next game. Now, next I wanted to take a look at a Ratchet and Clank, and again, we're doing 1440p TAA native here, all maxed out setting, except for object range. I've left it to default, which is 6. And we're just making our way towards this mission indoors here. And this game does actually have very good looking ray tracing. Actually, we have ray trace reflections, ambient occlusion, and shadows, I believe. So it is quite a bit of a demanding game. It's also quite a bit demanding on VRAM as well, which I have run into VRAM issues, by the way, with the 3080 Ti at 4K and ray tracing in this game. So this is a Nix's game. Nix's games can be quite VRAM hungry, but as you can see, the 7900 XTX does really well here. We had very nice and smooth frame times. We ended up averaging 62 FPS at the end of the run with 46 1% low, so very good. Now this game, I've tested both of these GPUs prior, and the 3080 Ti and 7900 XTX can actually be very similar in performance here at 1440p anyway. So yeah, let's take a look at the 3080 Ti. Alright, so we're back on the 3080 Ti now. We're using the same settings, 1440p native TAA, with all the settings maxed out as well. Now, performance-wise, FPS, I guess you could say, well, it's actually very comparable to the 7900 XTX. As a matter of fact, we averaged 62 FPS on the 7900 XTX versus 67 FPS on the 3080 Ti. So the 3080 Ti was able to create, render more frames, but the 1% lows, as you can see on the frame time graph, are not particularly great. Although it wasn't a massive difference. We had 46 FPS 1% lows on the 7900 XTX, and on the 3080 Ti we have 39 FPS. But as you can see, there is tiny little hitches that happen every now and then. And again, that could be due to VRAM, not entirely sure. I've only run into like severe issues at 4K. It doesn't matter if you use DLSS or not, as long as you have ray tracing enabled. That does add to a bit of more VRAM consumption. But I mean, other than that, the game still is pretty good, but I would say the XTX was a little bit smoother, as you can tell by looking at the frame time. So yeah, very interesting, very good looking game, and a very fun game to play. So another game I took a look at, because I recently was playing it actually for another video, and I said why not check it out on the 7900 XTX, was the Dead Space remake. It doesn't have any complex ray tracing or anything, but it does have ray traced ambient occlusion, so I added it on the list. This is one of those games where the XTX crushes it, right? I would say this is one of those games where ray tracing isn't really all that transformative, doesn't really hold up all that well to the topic of this video, I guess, because I wanted to look at games that have a bit more complex ray tracing, but I wanted to look at this nonetheless. And yeah, man, we're getting really good performance. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is the amount of FPS that we're getting here is almost identical to what we were getting with Indiana Jones. And I think maybe that can show you guys how much to appreciate the great work that the Indiana Jones developers have done with optimizing that game, which clearly has more complex ray tracing than this game, and it runs at the same FPS. But yeah, Dead Space Remake has come a long way, because I remember it being extremely stuttery, and it's running buttery smooth on the 7900 XTX. I don't see any stutters whatsoever. But yeah, guys, I guess there's gonna have to be a part 3 to this video, because I have a few other games that I've recorded that I want to show you guys, like Star Wars Outlaws, Control, The Ascent. I don't know if you guys remember that game, but that game had very interesting ray tracing in it. And we're going to take a look at that as well, and also Jedi Survivor. So there will be a part 3 to this video. Unfortunately, Cyberpunk took me a lot longer, but I did want to go over those things and show you guys how I would use the 7900 XTX and kind of utilize every tool in the tool bench, which is what you should be doing. Regardless of the GPU you have, you can always make tweaks and adjustments to tailor your experience to how you want. And with FSR 4 around the corner, I'm actually very excited to see, and hopefully developers can update their games so that we can take advantage of FSR 4, because it looks really, really good. And I'm very excited for the RX 9070 XT as well, because, well, according to AMD, they've made some very nice improvements to ray tracing, and I am a big ray tracing fan, and that's what I like to talk about on this channel, is things that I'm a fan of, and share it with you guys. But speaking of you guys, what do you think? Leave your comments down below. I would really like to hear your opinions. If you have any suggestions, let me know. I'll take anything into consideration, criticism, whatever it might be. But I do appreciate you guys watching, and I hope I've earned your subscription or even a like. I'd really appreciate it. But anyway, I hope you all have a great one. We'll look at part 3 and wrap up this series. I'm excited for the next games. I'll see you on the next one though. Peace out.